Good morning, everyone. This is Subhash Gatade. I welcome you all to the 24th lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series, organized by New Socialist Initiative. Democracy Dialogues, as you know, is a conversation we started during the pandemic to understand the challenges faced by democracy in India and elsewhere. Leading intellectuals, writers have participated in this discussion, and we feel honored that Professor Pranab Bardhan is here to address us this morning. He's professor at University of Berkeley. We are extremely thankful to him for agreeing to share his views here. Professor Pranab Bardhan, as most of you know, is a prolific writer and holistic editor, author of 17 books and editor of 14 others. His latest book, entitled A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries, was published by Harvard. His memoir, Charayvati, An Academic's Global Journey, is being published by HarperCollins in late 2023. His memoir in Bengali has also been published in 2014. He has studied at Presidency College and at Cambridge University, and he has been a faculty at the MIT and different other institutes before joining Berkeley. He has done theoretical and field studies research on rural institutions in poor countries, on political economy of development policy, and on international trade. This morning, he will be enlightening us about the erosion of liberal democracy in India. Friends, please welcome Professor Pranab Bardhan. Please. You can start, Professor Prabhat.
Oh, shall I start?
Please.
Yes. No, this is for morning for you. This is late night for me. But I'm very glad that I have this opportunity to participate in this lecture series that you have. This is the 24th, right? You just mentioned two of my recent books. I shall give you the background. From spring 2020 to roughly spring 2022, these 2 years, when the pandemic affected most of us, and we were homebound and or essentially house arrest. I used this time primarily to write these two books. One is, of course, a memoir, which is going to come out in Delhi end of November by HarperCollins. And the other book, with which I'm going to start, even though the book is in a global context, not on India, but it is on democratic disenchantment in rich and poor countries. And India is certainly one of the countries that I had in mind. So let me start with that book. Obviously, it's well known now. I don't have to spell it out. There has been erosion of democracy, liberal democracy, all over the world. In rich countries, we know about Trump. We know about the people supporting Brexit in Britain. We know people and actually right now, after my book was published, in Italy, there is a party that is in power which traces its roots to fascism or proto-fascism. In Sweden, the strongest party now is extreme right-wing party, which also traces its roots to neo-Nazi movement. And of course, in other parts of Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, the extreme right-wing is in power. In countries where extreme right-wing is not in power, but quite substantial support is in France, Germany, etc. And among developing countries, apart from India, Turkey, and then Brazil under Bolsonaro, even though Bolsonaro lost the recent election, his party is very strong in the Brazilian legislature. So it's a global phenomenon. So my book, this book essentially, which was published last year, and it is, by the way, HarperCollins has brought out a cheap, distributing a cheaper Indian edition of the book. So it's available in the market. In this book, I started thinking about the background of this phenomenon, this worldwide phenomenon. So that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is about what to do. Things are very difficult. It's not very easy. It's easier to talk than to do. But I have some ideas. And actually, some of those ideas I will share with you. But most, if you are interested, you should read that book. That's the second half of the book. Now, in understanding this phenomenon, one of the popular ideas has been that this is a reaction of workers all over the world to the extreme inequality all over the world. In fact, in much of the world, economic inequality has been rising. Even in countries where it has not been rising, the level is quite high. In India, it's high as well as rising. Unfortunately, the Indian government doesn't believe in data, so we don't have a recent data. But there is one source, by the way, those who are interested, there is one source of data which is collected about every 10 years, is data on inequality of wealth. And that data will tell you that inequality of wealth has been going up and is extremely high. In fact, inequality of wealth in India is now reaching Latin America. Latin America is one of the most unequal parts of the world. Indian wealth inequality is reaching the Latin range of Latin American inequality. So a lot of people have said this is the workers' anger about this rising inequality. I, in my book, said even though I am very much, I think I hear an echo. Is that a problem for you? I'm hearing an echo.
No, it's fine.
Okay, let me continue. So even though I'm very much worried about inequality, and in fact, much of my academic research work is on inequality, I personally think the workers' anger is not so much about inequality. People have talked about the rise in the wealth of the top 1%. But I think the workers do not have much good idea of how the top 1% live or accumulate their wealth. I think the workers are much more concerned about insecurity than inequality. Insecurity in their own lives. They are not that much bothered by how the rich has become richer. In fact, in many of these countries, the workers who are following the right-wing leaders, many of these right-wing leaders are billionaires. Trump is a billionaire. The original Brexit leader in UK, Nigel Farage, is hundreds of millions of dollars worth of wealth. In France, Marine Le Pen is a billionaire. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, these are right-wing leaders, billionaires. In Turkey, Erdogan is a billionaire. In Russia, Putin is a billionaire. In India, Modi is not a billionaire, but he's cozy with billionaires. So if the workers are really angry about billionaires' wealth, many of these workers are going with the billionaires. So we have to think about other reasons. And in my book, I discuss a lot of issues relating to inequality, insecurity. And I discuss economic insecurity meaning losses of jobs, losses of income, etc. But in my book, there's also a lot of emphasis on cultural insecurity. And I will come to issues of cultural insecurity a little later. But the point that I want to make right now, and the point with which the book starts, is inequality, insecurity. These are left-wing issues. Why are the workers turning right instead of left? If they're really worried about inequality and insecurity, they should have turned left. We know in many countries, including India, the leftist alternative is becoming, in the political field, increasingly obsolete, if I may put it in a blunt terms. And I'm going to discuss why in terms of economic policies, in terms of political mobilization, and in terms of governance methods in areas where left used to govern, where used to be important, politically important. I'm going to try to trace some of the reasons for the failure of the left. It is not enough. We all agree that we cannot accept the semi-fascist right, but just blaming the semi-fascist right is not enough. It's very easy for me. I call it cheap talk. It's very easy to criticize the fascists, but that doesn't explain why poor people are supporting them. We have to understand that. Now, in my book, the first part of the book, I give about 5 or 6 different reasons why the workers are turning to the right. I don't have time, and most of it is in a global context, so I'm not going to go there. But for the Indian context, I'm going to just point to 2 reasons, and that will be my launching ground for today's lecture. One reason is that for the marauding right, for many decades, all over the world, and also in India, a major source of resistance was provided by organized workers. Organized labor was the major force of resistance to the progress of the right, to the advance of the right. Yet, labor organizations are in some decline all over the world. In fact, if you look at data about trade unions, membership, activity, and all those, and in my book, I cite some of the data, trade unions are in decline all over the world. And it is not unconnected with the fact that all over the world, both in rich and poor countries, labor share in national income is declining because trade unions are no longer able to provide that kind of resistance that they used to have. India particularly, labor movement is very weak, certainly compared to some European countries. Indian labor movement is very weak. And I'm going to very briefly mention why the Indian labor movement, organized labor movement, is so weak. One reason, of course, and this is not just today, for many, many years, Indian labor, there's a lot of social divisions. So they're not as unified as in some other countries. And I'm going to come to these divisions later. Secondly, I mean, the divisions usually in terms of caste, in terms of religion, in terms of community, in terms of language, in terms of regional loyalties. Second reason for why in India, the organized labor is weak is because quite often, not always, but quite often, the leadership of organized labor is provided by political parties. So trade union, there is a Congress trade union, there is a CPI trade union, there's a CPM trade union, there's a BJP trade union, and so on. So quite often, the leaders of the trade union movement, they're not factory workers. They come from the political parties. So they're outsiders. So they try to organize workers in terms of all India issues, all India political issues. They are not as sensitive as they should have been to that particular factory where these laborers, there is some labor unrest. They're not that focused on the local issues. They're more often, because they come from political parties, they bring larger national political issues. So that's that's a second weakness. A third, of course, and this is a problem with many developing countries, and certainly true of India, is that most of the workers are outside trade unions. Most of the workers are in what is called the informal sector. The informal sector where there is no pensions, there's no benefits, and so on. In fact, a large part of the informal sector are what economists call, these people are not wage laborers. They are self-employed. So for example, if you are a poor farmer, you are self-employed. You work on your tiny family farm. You are not a wage laborer. Then there, of course, there are wage laborers, but quite often these wage laborers are in the informal sector. And this is, I would say, a major failure of the left in India. In all these many, many decades of labor movement in India, to this day, about 80% of the workers are informal. They're outside most labor organizations. So if you think of it as a metaphor, Indian labor, organized labor, is a tiny island surrounded by a vast ocean of unorganized, informal, unprotected workers. This was there 100 years back, and this is true even today. And that I would regard as a symptom of one of left's major failures. Now, this is something that requires a lot of attention. By the way, if you ask me, there are some informal workers' organization. In fact, if you ask me what is the most important and well-known informal labor organization in India, it is SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association. And to me, it's interesting, this most successful or best known informal workers union was not organized by the left. It was organized by a Gandhian, Ella Bhatt, in Gujarat. So I think the left's failure in terms of informal labor organization is true in developing countries. And I'll tell you, it is possible to organize. SEVA is a good example to understand. SEVA knows many of these women workers, what kind of problems they face. Their problems are not about wage bargaining. Quite often they're self-employed, so there's nobody to bargain wage with. But their problems like these women require childcare, These women require for their small business, they require covering insurance for risks. So SEVA, for example, many years back, worked out a deal with Life Insurance Corporation of India to cover the risks that these small workers face. So the problems they face are very different from the usual trade union problems that the left usually deal with. This is a problem, as I said, informal problem, the worker problem is all over the world in developing countries, but in India is a particularly so, because in India, as I said, at least 80% of the workers are informal. It is not easy to organize the informal workers, but there should at least be attempts. And I've said these informal workers have been organized by some small numbers, but not by the left. Now, one way one can think about, and I do discuss this in the second part of my book, think about issues which combine the formal workers and the informal workers. So you think about common platform. So for example, I'll tell you, in India, some of the most organized trade unions are in the better off sectors. Even in the formal sector, the most organized, quite often organized by the left, are workers who are well paid, and their conditions of work are much better than the overwhelming majority of workers. So for example, Bank Employees Association is a highly organized workers, and these are the better off workers. But their demands, why would a poor informal worker would be interested in their demands? Because nobody, their bank employees' salaries are many, many times what an informal worker earns. So their demands and informal workers' needs are quite different. So we have to think about, if you are interested in making the informal workers join this movement, we have to think about common platforms, things that will interest both the formal workers and informal workers. And I'll give you some examples. If the labor movement make them the primary demand, and at least the primary focus of their attention, these common platforms, then I think you can get the informal workers interested. So one common platform could be something that is missing in India, is universal healthcare. Everybody, whether you are a formal worker, informal worker, you must have the right to have covered by healthcare. Universal healthcare, public healthcare. What we have today in India, which the Modi government pushes, is Ayushman Bharat. Ayushman Bharat is not universal healthcare. Ayushman Bharat follows not the universal healthcare model. I'm not thinking just of, say, National Health Service in Britain or a similar public health service in France. I'm thinking, forget about rich countries. Even if you take a neighboring developing country, they have a much better universal healthcare system than India. And this country is Thailand. Thailand has a much better universal healthcare. Ayushman Bharat is more in the American model, which is a disastrous model of healthcare. So, but I don't want to go into the details of that. I just want to say universal healthcare, demand for universal healthcare could be a common demand for both formal workers and informal workers. Similarly, universal access to publicly financed childcare. This has been a tremendous boon to women workers. Women workers' participation rate in India is one of the worst in the whole world. Very small percentage of women work participation. They are overworked at home, but in the standard labor force, their participation rate is very low. and universal access to daycare or to childcare would have been provided a common platform if the woman works in the formal sector or informal sector. A third common platform could be universal access to vocational education. Most of the time, the education that we give to our children does not make them employable. You talk to most businessmen, they will tell you, you may have a degree, but that does not make you employable, because the skills that you need for work in many branches of work are not immediately covered by the kind of education, the quality of education that we have. So universal access to vocational education, that kind of education that is intimately connected with different vocations. The best example in the world of vocational education is Germany. In Germany, as soon as you finish school, most of them, you don't go to the regular colleges or regular universities. Most of the stream is taken to vocational education. Only the academically minded go to colleges and universities. But most people are given training and vocational training. And this is missing in large parts of India. So again, if you demand universal access to vocational education, then this will appeal to both formal workers and the much larger number of informal workers. And the fourth one, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Fourth one is something that I have been advocating for the last, I first advocated in Delhi in 2010. So that's 13 years back. I've been since then, I've been a systematic advocate of universal basic income. Namely, everybody, all citizens should be entitled, should have the right, and I call it a right, not a gift like with Modi's picture. No, I'm not thinking of those welfare schemes that the current government has with the Prime Minister's picture or Prime Minister's image all the time. I want this as a right. Everybody should have the right to minimum economic security, and universal basic income is one part of that. And I have calculated, and some of the calculations I repeat in my book, I have calculated that in India, if you take away the subsidies that currently go to the better off, then the government, without touching any other welfare programs, can afford to have a pretty decent universal basic income. Not very high, but for the very poor, it will be a pretty decent universal. So if you say universal basic income, it will again, because everybody will benefit, so it will, both formal and informal workers will support it. And I've said, even if you in the beginning, the government cannot afford it, at least give it to half the population, which is women. Give to women, because women's work is not recognized. So just think how the women's status and autonomy will improve if every month in their bank account, in their Jan Dhan account, a basic income is deposited. So I'm very much in favor of universal basic income, but at the moment, I'm giving that as an example of uniting formal and informal workers, because I think that division is very harmful. The division between formal and informal workers make it difficult to organize the overwhelming majority of our workers. Let me now move to a slightly different point, although still on the context of labor organization. And this is something that has worried me for quite some time. The left trade unions are usually more successful with the public sector employees. And I already gave an example of the banks, public banks. They're the most highest paid. Now, we know that in many parts, not in all, but in many parts of India, public sector employees in many government offices have been accused of being corrupt, have been accused of being callous to common people's needs, and there has been accusation of the public sector employees being truant. What do I mean by truant? And this is now a lot of data will show you. If you on a given day, without announcement, you go and visit a school in India, on an average, 50% of the time you will find the teacher has not come, the teacher is absent, or the teacher, even though it's present, the teacher is not teaching. This is what I'm calling, apart from corrupt, callous, truant. They are not there. Now, if that is the image, and these are all unionized, quite often, not all, but quite often they're unionized teachers. Okay? So if you are a poor person, illiterate, but you want your child to get education, but the government school, the teachers, by the way, what I'm saying about teachers is also true about public health clinics. Not the hospitals, but the smaller clinics. Doctors don't come, nurses don't come, etc. Now, if this is the image of unionized workers, contrast that with the same services sometimes provided by the extreme right wing. For example, what I have in mind, since I'm talking about schools, I have in mind the schools run by the RSS in India. There are tens of thousands of such schools all over India. So, for example, if you belong to a tribal district or where the substantial numbers of the people are Adivasis, and you as a parent, you want your children to be educated, the government schools are not there, or even if they're there, they're dysfunctional in the way that I've described. In many of these areas, the alternative is the RSS school. By the way, the RSS, as you know, don't call them Adivasis. They call them Vanavasis, because their theory is the Hindus are the originals, and they're not Adivasis. These people are not Adivasis. They're Vanavasis. So there are tens of thousands of Vanavasi schools all over these remote areas, tribal India, different parts of India. So many often, Adivasi parents will very gladly go to the RSS schools. And the RSS schools are giving that service very enthusiastically. They're, of course, part of their job, part of their mission is to poison the minds of the little children so that they grow up to be citizens believing in Hindutva. That is their purpose. But whatever their purpose, for the Adivasi parent, here is a school that is functioning. Whereas the government school, for various reasons, are not functioning. So I want you to, for a minute, contemplate this difference. One is the image of a non-functional school run by unionized teachers. And the other is functioning, highly motivated, wrong motive though, highly motivated Vanavasi school of RSS. And they are very enthusiastic to take your children, free. So in this kind of a situation, again, one can see why these Adivasis sometimes are voting for BJP. In fact, this is the thing that we have to understand. I don't think anybody has a full understanding. Why is it the current BJP government, quite often, if you take the national elections, nearly 1/3 of Adivasis vote for the poorest people in India. Among the poorest people in India Adivasis vote for a party which is ideologically Brahminical. RSS is ideologically Brahminical, even though they will make noise about OBCs and others, but its ideology is mainly Brahminical. And yet, Dalits and Adivasis are voting, not majority, but in significant numbers, about 1/3. So BJP wins because they get 2/3 of the vote of the upper castes, they get about half the votes of OBCs, and they get as large as 1/3. This is, I'm talking about national election studies data that are available. So we have to understand this. And this is, again, to me, a symptom of left failure, because one would have thought Dalits and Adivasis, the poorest of India, would have would go for the left rather than this extreme right. Let me mention something else, and this refers to an economic policy. I've always noticed that in two countries that I'm familiar with, workers are very much against globalization. These two countries I'm thinking is United States and India. Very much, by and large, not all, but very much workers are against globalization. And I've tried to understand this, particularly in contrast to other countries. Whenever you mention globalization, the left will give you the standard rhetoric of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, global capitalism, and so on. But I think while all this is understandable, I think we are trapped in old rhetoric. So if you look at the history of the last 30 years, at least 30 years, which is the country that benefited most from globalization? China. The Chinese Communist Party has been, until very recently, now because of Cold War, etc., has been pro-globalization. In fact, they clamored for becoming a member of the WTO, and they became a member, and essentially defeated the West in their own game. They're very much pro-globalization. That's the last 30 years. If we look at the history of the last 10 to 15 years, which other country has been a major beneficiary of globalization? Is Vietnam. Bangladesh to some extent, but Vietnam primarily. And Vietnamese Communist Party is very much pro-globalization. So I have tried to understand this, that our left and the American left is very much anti-globalization. And in America, it's even more so because the Chinese have succeeded in quite often uprooting their workers. Let me tell you, in 1990, first, I've been to China many times until COVID. I used to go to China almost once every year. So I have a pretty good idea how Chinese Communist Party, as well as most of the people I mixed with were academics in China. They're by and large, they're very much pro-globalization. The first time I went to Vietnam was in 1990. The first thing that struck me is this is a country, I didn't expect it, but this is a country poorer at that time than India. Today, Vietnam's per capita income is about 3 times India's. And largely of the success, not entirely, but a large part of the success is their vigorous participation in the globalization process. But we still are trapped in the old anti-imperialist rhetoric of globalization. I'm giving globalization as an example. I could give you many other examples of old rhetoric still very dominant in India. The other thing is the nature of international trade has changed, and we have not kept up with it. The nature of international trade has changed, that most of trade now is in buying and selling of parts, components, and ingredients. Let me give you an example. In our trade with China today. So, for example, India is going in a big way for the renewable energy industry. The renewable energy industry, suppose you are thinking of solar energy. India should do well in solar energy. And I think it's good that you are now going to in that direction. But who are the world's largest seller of solar panels? China. So if you go against trade, international trade, go against globalization, then what will happen? The solar panels will be very costly in India. Chinese sell them in very cheap, and that's why they dominate the world market in solar panels. So if you go against international trade, you are hurting yourself, because then going to a renewable energy will be very difficult. Another example, Chinese are one of the world's largest, particularly for India, one of the largest suppliers of ingredients of medicines. Many medicines, the ingredients, the Chinese are the largest supplier. So again, if you stop international trade, you are denying yourself that cheaper ingredient, so your medicines will be more expensive in India. So I'm just giving them as example. I could give you 30 such examples where going against globalization hurts us. In fact, last week I read an article by Raghuram Rajan, who used to be the governor of Reserve Bank. He has written an article. The title is, "Who benefits from Modi's Atmanirbhar policy?" Atmanirbhar is against international trade, self-reliance. Who benefits from Atmanirbhar? Raghuram Rajan satirically says it's Vietnam, not India. Because we, as of now, we cannot compete with Vietnam. Forget about China. We cannot compete with China. But even we are now cannot compete with Vietnam, and Vietnam will be gaining because we are having tariffs on many products. As part of Atmanirbhar. So here I find, and this is I've commented on, there's a bit of economic nationalism of the left as well as the right. In RSS, there is a very powerful part of RSS. It's called Swadeshi Jagaran Manch. Swadeshi Jagaran Manch is for Atmanirbhar, self-reliance, and against dependence on imports, against globalization. So say with the left. So right and left are convergent on this. And those who support globalization, they are neoliberals. Neoliberal is a way of essentially disparaging, because they're trapped in the old rhetoric. Things are changing. We are not changing. Our thinking is not changing accordingly. I've talked about one other economic issue that I wanted to mention, and this is something that I discussed quite a lot. Unfortunately, this is hardly mentioned in the Indian discussion. It is discussed in other countries, and I want to bring it up. In the trade union movements, the standard emphasis is on wage bargaining. And I already told you, wage bargaining is not the main issue for large numbers of our informal workers, because they're self-employed. Wage bargaining is not their major problem. So we have been focused, our left trade unions have been focused on wage bargaining. But I think we have to go beyond that. Even for wage workers, we have to go beyond that. And that is here, I think increasingly, people are thinking in terms of not just wage, our demands, workers' demands, that we should have a seat in the corporate governing board, improve the voice of workers examples of countries where this is quite important. It has been successful. And it is not a socialist country. The most successful case, again, is Germany. It's a country now ruled by social democrats, but even when Germany used to be ruled by Christian democrats, the same was true. Germany, the majority of the large firms, the majority, not just one or two cases, the majority of large companies, if you look at the top governing board, half of the governing board is worker representatives. So worker representatives have a big say in what should be the company policies. Company policies with respect to job allocation, company policies to outsourcing, company policies to what is called, economists call R&D, research and development. Why is that important? And this is, by the way, Indian companies' R&D, research and development, is very low, and it is not a coincidence that Indian companies R&D is not merely R&D is low. As a result, Indian companies' productivity is very low, because R&D gives you new technology, new ways of doing things, and productivity is low in Indian companies relative to other countries, because R&D as a percentage of company profits is very low. By the way, R&D as a percentage of company revenue, not merely very high in rich countries, but among developing countries, is very high in China, is very high in South Korea. But India is one of the lowest. Private companies I'm talking about. So, but why am I bringing it in the context of R&D? So if workers have a voice in the governance, most of the new technology that you hear about is labor saving. It hurts labor, namely new technology, automation, and now AI, artificial intelligence, replaces labor. I call it labor replacing technology. It's going to hurt workers. It's already started hurting workers in Western countries. So if labor organizations become important in company governance policies, it will also influence companies' R&D policies. And R&D, and this is now, there's a lot of work going on right now, that you can do research and development not in a labor replacing direction, but in a labor using direction, in a labor empowering direction. At the moment, it is going in the labor replacing direction because companies want to make money and they want to save on labor cost. If unions and worker representatives are important in the company's governance structure, they can influence the pattern of innovation, not just the rate of innovation, the pattern of innovation in a more labor empowering direction rather than in a labor replacing direction. As technology improves, this will be increasingly an important issue for labor. Another issue that's very important, particularly in India and the United States, if you ask me, these are the two largest democracies in the world. I have problems with calling India a democracy now, but that's a different issue. These two large democracies, there is one interesting commonality, and that is, which are the two countries in the world which have the largest spending in elections provided by corporate donations? Again, United States and India. United States, the last election, of course, these are very difficult to estimate, but imperfect estimates tell you United States last presidential election, 2020 presidential election, total election spending, most of it is donated by the corporate sector, capital sector. came to about $14 billion. India, the estimates are even more imperfect, but some estimates that I've seen, the total expenditure in India is more like $6 to $8 billion. The second highest election spending in the whole world. But of course, these are large countries, so elections are expensive. But the important thing is most of the monies come from the capitalists, from the companies, corporate donations. And of course, India has this now peculiar system called electoral bonds. Under electoral bonds, a company can donate unlimited amounts and you don't have to disclose it. You don't have to, public will not know which party you are donating to. So this is a completely non-transparent system. And of course, we have now indirect estimates, 90% of these corporate donations go to BJP. Now, why am I bringing this here? In a sense, this is highly distorting democracy, both in India and the United States. And the corporate sector is not doing it out of charity. They do it because in return, the government will do things in terms of taxes, in terms of regulations to help them. So there's a quid pro quo between companies and the governments. So this is a major failure of liberal democracy. When you are essentially, the corporates are buying democracy. Democracy is for sale in India and the United States. It's because the corporate donations are so important. If corporate donations are important, then you can imagine if labor is a voice in how the company policies will be done, labor can influence that corporate donations. Labor can try to stop this distortion of democracy through corporate funding of elections. So you see the non-wage bargaining issue, because most of the time when you think about trade unions for wage bargaining, they don't often succeed. But I'm saying we have to restructure the goals of trade unions, goals of labor movement. So I've now talked about economic issues quite a bit. Let me now go into some non-economic cultural issues. The cultural issues I've already mentioned. The one problem with labor movement is that our labor is very much divided in terms of caste, ethnicity, religion, etc. Now take the case of religion. And let me first start with let me just say that when the left try to organize labor, they all talk about class politics, and rightly so. Class politics is extremely important, but that's not enough to mobilize workers, because workers are moved by many other issues, caste, ethnicity, etc. Just because we are in the left, we cannot ignore those issues. Let me talk about religion and from a personal point of view. I grew up in a household where my father was an atheist. And throughout my childhood, he has taught me why effect of religion on a person can be quite negative. Of course, he had in mind the influence of organized religion, but he used to quote Marx and this famous quotation that religion is the opium of the people. So as a result, I grew up also to be an atheist because of my father's heavy influence on me. But As I grew up, I could see that even I'm an atheist, I should be sensitive to a person who values spirituality. And let me give you the example of Marx himself. The line which my father used to quote always, religion is the opium of the people. Later, I read that piece of Marx, writing of Marx. If you read the previous sentence to that famous words, religion is the opium of the people, this is in a manuscript of Marx, 1844. And I'll read to you the previous sentence, and you will see what a difference. The previous sentence to the sentence where he says, religion is the opium of the people, he says, and I quote, religion is the sigh of the oppressed. Religion is a sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. So if you read that sentence, just the previous sentence, you can see Marx is much more sensitive to people who follow religion. This, of course, doesn't mean, in fact, we're talking about personal religion. But organized religion quite often spreads hate or spreads superstitions. So we should all be against it. But I'm just saying we should be a little more sensitive to personal religion. And we should keep that in mind in organizing, mobilizing workers. I'm just giving that as an example to say that mere talking class politics is not a good enough strategy for mobilizing workers. And in trying to understand why many of Dalits and Adivasis and even OBCs do not go for the left, is because we don't talk there. We are not sympathetic to their ways of thinking. Quite often what happens, and this is social psychologists would tell you, is that today the life is full of uncertainties, various insecurities and uncertainties. And quite often, religion acts as an anchor in a world of uncertainty, in a world of insecurity. And we should be even if we ourselves are not religious, we should be sensitive to the things that worry them. And of course, here, the decline of trade unions has played an important role. To me, trade unions all over the world, particularly I've seen in Western world, trade unions is not just an economic institution. Trade unions provided a cultural anchor. It provided a shared identity. You took pride as a member of a shared group of workers. So what has happened with the decline of trade unions, there's a cultural void, which the extreme right wing, the RSS and others are trying to fill in, and quite often successfully. And we have to be aware of that. If you just ignore, oh, we just follow only class politics, we don't worry about those cultural void issues, then workers will gradually leave you. You will not understand the workers, you are not sensitive to the workers. As I said, we are, of course, I'm not suggesting that you should follow these negative aspects of organized religion when it spreads hate, when it spreads superstition. But in terms of personal spirituality and personal need in a world of insecurities, we should be more sensitive. The next issue, I'm taking more time than I expected, but I'm going to take up two more major issues. Economically, economic system-wise, what is the alternative left is providing to the workers? Our rhetoric is, of course, anti-capitalist. And there are many reasons why capitalism is a wrong system. Capitalism is associated with exploitation, associated with inequality, associated with alienation, associated now, particularly important, with damage to the environment. So we are all agreed that capitalism has a lot of problems. By the way, I said just talked about environment. I can immediately, what comes to my mind immediately, it is not always the case. It's only capitalists who damage the environment. Let me spend 1 minute on that. If you think of the Soviet Union was one of the largest polluters in the world. To give you an example, there are many examples of that. There are a lot of data about that. Soviet Union, if you think about the Russian geography, Soviet Union used to have one of the fourth largest inland sea. It's called Aral Sea. Aral Sea is the fourth largest inland sea anywhere in the world. Huge sea. Over time, it died. Why? Even when the Soviet Union was existing, it died already in the Soviet regime because of various reasons, all kinds of pollution, all kinds of encroachments, all kinds of agricultural intensification, etc. So it is not just the case, even though I agree that capitalism often destroys environment. I'm just saying it is not capitalism alone. It is a certain pattern of development which Soviet Union was very much following. And the other thing that is important is lack of democracy. Since Soviet Union did not have democracy, while all this pollution is going on, there was no movement against it because you don't encourage free expression of opinion. So to me, democracy is extremely important for the environmental movement. And leftists have to recognize that democracy is important for environment. But let me go back to the general issue of capitalism. Yes, we all agree capitalism has lots of problems. So the question then is, obvious question is, what is the alternative you are giving? You can cite textbooks, you can cite sacred texts, Marx, Lenin, Engels. But what is the alternative we are providing? So in India, the Indian left will say, oh, our alternative, we should nationalize the industry. The state should take over. Take these 3 states where the left had power. One of those states, left still has power, Kerala. The other 2 states, left power is gone, West Bengal and Tripura. Take these 3 states, rhetoric was always anti-capitalist. So who will run the industries? The state. Give me one example of these 3 states where there's a state taken over of an industry has been flourishing, has provided a very successful running of industry. There are very few. There may be 1 or 2 small cases, but in general, the left has not succeeded providing an anti-capitalist way of organizing a factory, organizing an enterprise, etc. Other countries have. Some other countries, I could give you examples from South Korea, Singapore, France, etc. But in Indian left, and this is one of the big deficiencies, failures, that we have not been able to provide a good counter example. We are very good at criticizing the capitalists, but show me a good, positive example. Otherwise, all this criticism is empty, irresponsible. What other non-capitalist enterprises there could be? There could be, for example, cooperatives. And there are many cooperatives in India. Most of them, unfortunately, are not functioning well, because quite often, even when a cooperative starts, very soon it becomes a facade of a bureaucratic. It wants a state to take over, and then it essentially becomes a bureaucratic facade of a bureaucratic organization. Again, there are successful examples of cooperative in India. The most well-known is Amul in Gujarat. Today, Amul has been taken over, is run mainly by the BJP. But Amul has been successful for many decades. But Amul has never been, the left has never been important in organizing that kind of cooperative. The successful cooperatives, the few successful cooperatives, were not left organizations. Just as SEBA was the informal workers organization, a Gandhian organization. In some cases, some cooperatives are Gandhian, and some other cases, others, not left. Another form of non-capitalist enterprise where workers run the industry or workers run the factory is called worker-managed enterprises. Again, let me tell you a personal story. Many years back, I was invited by the communist government in Kerala to give them some advice on the way the Kerala plantations, mostly tea plantations, rubber plantations, spice plantations. So the communist government in Kerala, I was teaching in Delhi School of Economics at that time. They invited me to give them some advice. In fact, that's the only time I've advised any government in the world, anywhere in the world, is a communist government in Kerala. So in that context, I visited all these plantations. Kerala is the one part of the country I've really traveled all across the state. So I called the trade unions in Kerala. Most of the trade unions are communist controlled, CPI, CPM, etc. But there were some others, RSP and a few others. So I called all the leaders of the trade unions in I remember one or two meetings. I said, look, the Kerala government wants me to advise them about how the plantations should be run. And they have sent me their memoranda, these trade unions, and unanimous, whether it's a left trade union or a right trade union, they're unanimous. It should be run by the government. It should be nationalized. The plantations should be nationalized. That is their unanimous demand. So I remember telling the trade union leaders, so you want these plantations to be run by bureaucrats who know very little about running plantations. You want them because then you can agitate for higher salaries, higher wages. But are you interested in the good running of the plantation, which ultimately will help the workers? Then how do you react if I tell you that I want to advise the Kerala government that this should all be run by workers? This should be worker-managed enterprises. Now, I can immediately imagine problems. One, workers may not have the experience how to manage. I said, that's not a problem. You can hire expert managers. You may hire good managers. You pay their salaries. So it's not that you have to know how to manage. After all, the capitalist doesn't know how to manage. They will hire managers. Other problem is that running a business has risks. Another problem, running a business, you have to borrow money. So I said, if I recommend to the Kerala government that it should be worker managed, I will make sure to recommend that at the same time, workers should have the power to hire the managers, expert managers. Workers should be insured for risks. The worker enterprise should be insured for risks. The Kerala government should help in risk management through some intermediaries. And Kerala government should make sure that there's enough credit. So I told these trade union leaders, would you agree to worker-managed, non-capitalist, worker-managed plantations with these kind of help in terms of risk management, in terms of risk coverage management and credit and borrowing? You know, I was surprised. I was unpleasantly surprised. Immediately, all the trade union leaders, right or left, told me, no, no way, we don't want this. So they are not interested in this non-capitalist form, even when I'm promising them help. They want them to be run by bureaucrats, a nationalized industry run by bureaucrats who know nothing about running plantations. And that one of the reasons why whenever in these 3 states, as a state has taken over, quite often the result has been disastrous. Because essentially it's run by bureaucrats who are not neither know nor are they interested in running. Essentially, it becomes a matter of patronage distribution, whom they distribute patronage to people they know, etc. So essentially, the way that these state takeovers work, and ultimately they fail, is because essentially it becomes centers of patronage distribution, not a responsible organization. So this is what I would say we have to provide. If the left wants to be credible, the left has no credibility on this. If the left wants to be credible, they have to provide responsible, constructive alternatives to capitalism. Otherwise, all this talk against capitalism is completely empty, if you ask me. Because left has no credibility, because they cannot provide examples of successfully running. Before I go to my last topic, there's one other thing that I wanted to tell you. This issue about why the left fails again and again in India has bothered me for many, many decades. And I've written about it extensively. Let me give you 2 articles, refer you to 2 articles that I wrote. Around 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Economic Political Weekly, I wrote a long article. And you can imagine what I wrote from the title of the article. The title of the article was "The Avoidable Tragedy of the Left in India." The avoidable tragedy of the left in India. Because I think there's a tragedy coming, and in fact, we're very much there now, but it is avoidable. So that's what I wrote, a long article on this, going into various suggestions. Then I wrote another article with the same title. The title was "Avoidable Tragedy of the Left in India 2." It's a sequel. When did I write it? 2011. The first one was around 1991. The second I wrote in 2011, after the West Bengal government, CPM government fell after 34 years of rule. And now they have 0 seats in the West Bengal legislature. They used to be the dominant party, and now they're 0. It's a pathetic situation. So when the left government fell in 2011, I wrote an article again in Economic and Political Weekly with the same title. But now I gave, apart from giving my arguments, I also gave a lot of data. For the previous 10 years, more than 10 years, 15 years before 2011, I, along with the whole team, was doing village surveys in West Bengal. So essentially, we went back again and again to the same villages. We had a random sample of about 89 villages with about 2,400 households. So we went back again and again to understand their problems, and I have written books and articles on those. I'm not going into those. 2011, we went back to the same 2,400 households, and we asked them, how did they vote? We asked them many other questions, but one set of questions related to the 2011 election. Why did most of them who earlier used to vote for the CPM left government, why did they vote against the left government in 2011? We directly asked them, and we tabulated the data, and we published those tables in Economic Political Weekly. Let me just mention, because I'm running out of time, let me mention what was the main reason this random sample of voters, of people, our respondents gave, why they voted against the left government. We were expecting they will say, about the Singur and the Nandigram case of land acquisition. Surprisingly, that was not the major reason they gave. That was the major reason in that area, in the Singur Nandigram area. That was a very issue that they were worked up about. But if you take the whole of West Bengal, because remember I said our villages were random sample, so we could say about the whole of West Bengal, statistically reliably. Singur Nandigram or land acquisition was not the major reason. The major reason, the topmost reason in their mind, there were various Bengali words they used, but essentially our interpretation of those Bengali words were local tyranny, tyranny of the local mafia. In other words, the party at the local level became like a mafia. And I can, if anybody's interested, I can go into details. So, and this is when I talked about, I told you already in the beginning that I'll talk about left's economic policies, left's ways of mobilization, and I also talked about governance methods. And now I'm talking about that. At the local level, we can talk big rhetoric, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist rhetoric at the top level. But the local people, when they face these local leaders, they were running essentially mafia type rule. Just to give you one example, if you want to build a small building in that locality, you have to get the permission and bribe the local party official. And you have to hire only their approved contractors. You have to only get the materials for the house building only from their approved people. Essentially, there were cuts at every stage. Essentially, they were getting bribes from these people. And if you don't agree, these gundas will come. The local gundas will come and threaten you. That is what I'm calling mafia rule. So if the left governance, the image of left governance in people's mind is that, the old kind of anti-capitalist rhetoric is completely empty, completely counterproductive. Let me now come to the last, and I'll spend 2-3 minutes on that, and then I'll be done. Since my topic was erosion of liberal democracy, but I have, as I already mentioned, criticizing the right-wing extremists who are destroying India's democracy is very easy. You could do that, I could do that. You don't need me to tell you. But the reason I chose that, I think we have to understand why is it that people all over the world, workers are turning right rather than left. So the last point that I'm going to talk about is an even more general point. I would say liberal democracy to succeed requires an underlying ideology, which, and some of you may be surprised, very few thinking people in India believe in liberal democracy. And let me explain. So who are the people who are against liberal democracy, whether they say it or not. One is, of course, very easy. RSS is against liberal democracy, whatever they say. In fact, when the Constitution came into being, 26 January 1950, before that, long debates in Constituent Assembly. At that time, before 1950, when the Constitution was made, 1948-49, all you have to do, you can go to any library or maybe internet, read the editorials of the RSS the magazine organizer. Read the editorials. They are all against the Constitution. Why? They said it's Western. And they said they are not following Manusmriti. I'm glad that they did not follow Manusmriti. If they followed Manusmriti, untouchability would still be constitutional, right? So Manusmriti is illiberal. It's against women, against low caste. But RSS, it's because it's essentially a Brahminical party, Brahminical organization. They're against the liberal constitution. They're calling it Western, but what they really meant is it's a liberal constitution. And RSS is mainly a liberal thing. They talk about glorious ancient India, and glorious ancient India was not liberal. This was caste-ridden, completely hierarchical. Liberalism is against hierarchy. Liberalism is against oppression of people. So RSS is very easy to see why they never subscribed. Whatever their rhetoric is, they never subscribed to liberal democracy, believing in liberal democracy. Now I'm going to talk about two other groups whom you will be surprised that I call them illiberal too. I have great respect for Gandhians. In many ways, they're admirable. What they have done is, and of course, I have great respect for Gandhiji himself. But in some sense, the Gandhian ideology is not liberal either. Gandhian ideology is liberal in terms of their values of tolerance and in terms of religious pluralism. In fact, Gandhi used to always say that as a child, when his mother used to take him to the temple, the Hindu temple near Porbandar, in that Hindu temple, there was Gita as a sacred text, but next to it was the Quran, and next to it was the Bible. This Gandhi describes it, that his mother used to take him to the temple where Gita, Quran, and Bible were together. So Gandhi, right from his childhood, believed in religious pluralism. In that sense, it's consistent with liberalism. But there's a part of Gandhism which is not consistent with liberalism, to the extent Gandhians believe in the traditional hierarchical structure of Hindu society. That's not liberal. And if you follow Gandhiji himself, I would say he was quite an authoritarian as a father. I don't know how many of you have seen the play Gandhi versus Gandhi. It's about his son and Gandhiji. He was authoritarian as a father. He was authoritarian as a husband. He was authoritarian as the guru of his ashrams. Sabarmati ashram, when he was running it, he ran it with a great deal of paternal authoritarianism. So, for example, since Gandhiji himself did not believe in vaccination, those days we are talking about vaccination against smallpox, he did not allow any of the children to be vaccinated. In fact, some children died as a result. And Gandhiji, of course, would be in great mourning and self-punishment. He'll probably have fasting. But still, he did not believe in vaccination and imposed that on even the children, not just the adults. So Gandhi, I found, in that sense, is an authoritarian as a father, authoritarian as a husband, authoritarian as a guru of his ashrams. Even though, as I already said, he believed in other liberal values. Now let me come to the left. I grew up in West Bengal, and all from my childhood, all around me were Marxists. And they would tell you, liberal democracy is nothing but bourgeois democracy. I think this is a false rhetoric. Bourgeois democracy, dismissing the values of liberal democracy as bourgeois democracy, is an old Stalinist rhetoric. This is the way they justified repression. In Soviet Union, this is the way Chinese repression goes on. And this is the way repression in Cuba went on. Calling liberal democracy bourgeois democracy. There are a lot of things bad about liberal democracy, but there are also good things in liberal democracy, particularly respect for human autonomy, respect for human rights, basic human rights, is a part of liberal democracy. I have a friend who's a very well-known, famous Marxist economist. He used to be Marxist, now he calls himself democratic socialist. His name is Samuel Bowles. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a very good friend of mine. He once told me, I still remember, he says, I'm a democratic socialist. But having said that, he said, I'm first a Democrat, then a socialist. He said, because if there is no democracy, socialism loses much of its meaning. And yet, left quite often has dismissed the democratic part as bourgeois democracy. I think it's this. And what is the democracy you like? People's democracy. And now looking back at history, people's democracy in Soviet Union, people's democracy in China, people's democracy in Eastern Europe, people's democracy in North Korea have told us people's democracy has no respect for basic human rights. So they're basically illiberal, and to me, wrongly so. I've told you about anti-liberalism in RSS, anti-liberalism among Gandhians, and anti-liberalism among the left. So in a sense, the majority of thinking people in India have been anti-liberal. Let me just tell you, and some of you may already know, in 1948, when the Constitution was largely finished, right, Ambedkar gave a speech, a famous speech in 1948, I think it's November 1948. He said, democracy in India is only a top dressing in a soil that is basically undemocratic. Top dressing in a soil that is basically undemocratic. This doesn't mean that democracy has no chance, but we have to nurture it. It's a fragile plant. We have to nurture it. But if these groups that I mentioned, who are thinking people, who are not basically liberal, then you are undervaluing democracy. So let me now end by saying there are many things that are wrong with capitalism. There are many things that we should worry about, things like inequality, etc. But I think the time has come, if not, its time may be gone in some cases, when we have to think about where have our failures been? And we have to open to new ideas. And for that, I cannot cite any better authority than Marx. If you read, there's a book called Late Marx, but there are also other, at that time, Late Marx, the book written by sociologists, Late Marx. It's an old book now. I think the book came out in 1980s. A lot of quotations from Marx, how Marx himself was changing his views. particularly when he was studying Russian data at the end of his life. He was changing his views. And when some people complained to him that, no, this is not what you told us before, this is not Marxism. In fact, I can tell you about letters where he essentially said, we have to change our views if we look at how the world thinking is going. He said, I've come across new data in Russia. I have to change my views based on what I read about West European history. You cannot apply the same West European history lessons to other countries. And let me also remind you, most of you probably know, that Marx told his son-in-law that I'm not a Marxist because he did not believe in dogma. He changed his ideas as he got new information, saw new ideas. I think the left has to think anew, think about new ideas, not keep to the same sacred text, quoting from the same sacred text. And this, if we can go on in our inside groups, but this is not going to persuade workers. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking and exciting presentation, Professor Bardhan. And many. And before I invite other participants to share their ideas and share their questions in the chat box, so I will invite my friend and senior comrade Ravi to say a few words. Ravi, please.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you so much, Professor Bardhan, for such a lucid talk and such a robust analysis. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You can't imagine how much vindicated many of us here at New Socialist Initiative felt listening to you. Sometimes we felt we are listening to ourselves. Great talk. Also, I mean, forgive our self-advertisement when you were speaking about globalization. 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago, 1996, we wrote a book, Globalization of Capital, that those were the days when entire left was, and we are part of left, entire left was going against Dunkel draft and WTO was being formed. And we made the same argument that you made today, even if briefly, you did not have time to go into a lot of detail, but great talk, and we feel so happy, so vindicated. Before Subhash and Bhargav invite, there are many luminaries in the audience, for their comments, and we know it is getting late for you, but our signature question at Democracy Dialogues to our speakers have been about the relationship between democracy in a society with deep fault lines, where competitive electoral democracy tends to dig out very troublesome things from the social mind or social history, whatever you say. That has been and you have commented partly on that, but the way the present regime has come to power through democracy to undo democracy, our society, the deep fault lines in our society, we feel has played a role. So if you could comment a little bit more on that, but let me add, since we have got hold of you, let me add one more thing. Of course, what you say about left, we being part of left, still it resonates with us so well. And yet the world today and India today is not entirely the doing of left, whatever mistakes it may have made. So we often wonder among ourselves that the retreat of social democracy as well as liberal democracy for the last 40 years or so, why isn't the liberal Democrats and social democrats other than left, why do they find it so difficult? Why has the counter-revolution unleashed by likes of Reagan and Thatcher has been so long-lasting? Why has, we, in those days, we were students, probably you were at MIT as a teacher and I was as a student in the physics department, that was the Reagan time. We expected that this counter-revolution will be short-lived. Unfortunately, it has not remained short-lived. So do you see any structural reasons for retreat of welfare state, retreat of social democracy, and retreat of liberal democracy all across the world, the thing that you started your talk with? So I will stop with these two questions. I know it's quite late for you, but we go on for couple of hours after the lectures. We will not subject you to that, but and I will request all our speakers to be, all our commentators and question ask, those people who will ask question to be brief. But if you could make a comment to start with, make a comment on that.
The second issue that brought up, all I can tell you, if I may plug my book is exactly about that issue. And we see the global context. And as I said, the first half of the book is on diagnosing the problem. And the second half is on what to do, particularly in terms of how to modify capitalism, at the same time, how to modify our own thinking. And I call it a rejuvenation of social democracy including socialist democracy. So all I plead with you in response to your second question is that have a look at my book. But let me just mention something which is not widely known, is that the right wing is also changing. And and they have been much smarter in many ways. So for example, now there's a group of thinkers in the right wing, not so much in India, but in Europe, in the United States, who are arguing against capitalism. So it's the Reagan, Thatcher right wing is no longer the major dominant streak in right wing. For example, in Poland, the party that is in power is a Catholic, like our Hindu nationalists, they're Catholic nationalists. Okay. But they are very much in favor of this extreme right-wing Catholic nationalists, are very much in favor of the welfare state. They want a strong welfare state because this is the way they get the economic support of the workers. But then they influence them through the cultural issues. So for example, in Poland, you get the Catholic votes by being against abortion, by being against gay rights. So culturally they dominate, but meanwhile, they want the welfare state. They're very strong on welfare state. In a way, in a different way, Modi is doing the same by giving these welfare measures. So you will always point out Ujjwala, which is the subsidized gas cylinder, okay, with of course his photograph. And then Garib Kalyan, this free grains. So the right wing is not the Thatcher. These are not Thatcher Reagan. Modi is not a Thatcher Reagan right wing. He is for big crony capital, sure. But he's not a Thatcher Reagan free marketeer. Modi wants a strong state that controlled by himself and his party. So I think even the right has adjusted their position in a way that is advantageous to them. And I find the left much more adaptive. The right is much smarter in that respect. On the first question, I think the first question is one of the questions that I thought I mentioned it, namely, we have to see why is it that the left's usual constituency would have been the poor. And the majority of the people in India are poor. But why are the poor not voting? Why are the majority of the poor voting for Modi? We have to understand that. And that's the origin of my kind of cogitation in all this respect. So I think that's how should be our major inquiry. First, understanding, and then what to do about it. Understanding, why is it the poor don't vote for the left in by and large, in large measure? UP is one of the poorest states in the country. And yet, you know, we have a wild, it's a jungle raj in UP, with the right-wing jungle raj in UP. And the poor are supporting them. Gujarat and UP are where the destiny of India is being decided.
Yes. Before I invite other dignitaries, I will just request my comrade Bhargav to take some questions in chat box if there are any questions. Comrade Bhargav, please.
Sure. Thank you, Subhash. In fact, there are many comments in the chat box or conversations, but there are, leaving them aside, there are few questions formulated in a form of a question. So I would like to bring them to Professor Bardhan's notice. One question came about informality of labor. This question is posed by one Mr. Raj B. Informality of labor is a big problem across all third world countries. This is a structural issue. How come the left is to be blamed? How come the left is to be blamed for the continued existence of informality? This is one question.
Before I go to another question, I'll forget. So let me immediately say, I'm not blaming the left for informality. I'm blaming not doing something about organizing them. I'm not saying why they're informal sector. As an economist, I could give you a long speech on why there is informality. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying why the left is unsuccessful in organizing the informal. It's not easy, but I gave you the example of some non-left people organizing some of the informal, not the left. So we have to think about that. The informality as a structural issue is not the question here. There are a lot of questions in the chat box, and I will not have time for all of them. So could you select some and ask them to me, because I didn't have time to read the chat.
We are with us Professor Aditya Mukherjee. I will request him to share his comment or share his query. Professor Aditya Mukherjee. Is he here? Yeah, please go ahead. You are mute. You're not audible, sir. Oh,
no,
I'm
not hearing you.
You're not able to hear you.
Subhash, you have to do that. The host has to unmute him.
No, but I've just.
Ananya,
please.
They are already unmuted.
Unmute.
Some problem with their device.
Can you please try, Professor, again? Aditya Mukherjee, can you please try again? Oh, no. Some problem. Sorry.
Before that problem is resolved, let me take one more question from the chat box.
Please.
This is the question again by the same friend, Mr. Raj. What kind of 1 minute? This chat box is also running very fast. What kind of developmental path is suitable for India today, in your opinion? Can it hope to imitate China or Vietnam with a focus on manufacturing, or should it concentrate on service instead? This question has implications for trade union strategy building, and also for environmental sustainability. So I wanted to know your opinion on this. Can India even afford to envision envision a manufacture-centric development?
You see, in many ways, manufacturing has to be important in India. because the service sector is the largest sector in India. But service sector, I think we should not call the service sector as a whole, because there are all kinds of services. There are some service sectors which are doing well, the IT and the business information and so on. But those are high-skilled sector. Most of our poor people don't have the skills for that. So most of the poor people in the service sector are in the informal, again, the informal service sector, the local dhaba or the thelawala, the Toto driver, or so those are not high-skilled workers. Unfortunately, for various historical reasons, the overwhelming majority of workers are low-skilled or sometimes zero-skilled workers. And that's why I talked about the vocational program. Wherever they are not doing well. Even when they're in the service sector, even though service sector is now more than 50% of national income. Manufacturing, there is a lot of possibilities with some training. If manufacturing does not go in the direction of automation, and I already referred to that issue, manufacturing is possible, but there India has not done very well. The manufacturing sector where India has done relatively well, I'll give you two examples. Auto parts, the car parts and components, and small vehicles, India has done reasonably well. Three-wheelers, for example. And the other sector India has done well, manufacturing sector, is pharmaceuticals, in drugs, in selling drugs to the world. But these two sectors, the manufacturing is not low skill intensive. It requires high skills, particularly in pharmaceuticals, but also in the car industry. But if you take, say, a low skill intensive manufacturing sector, garments, textiles, which employ a lot of people. Bangladesh, our adjoining country, used to be much poorer than India, but no longer, has done much better than India. And I have thought about this for a long time. I don't think the issue has been resolved. But it is possible to do well in manufacturing. Vietnam's success that I referred to, largely based on manufacturing. But one advantage that Vietnam has is that its workers are better educated and better skilled than the average Indian worker in Vietnam. So one of the reasons why Vietnam, in a sense, has stepped in where China succeeded before, again, average Chinese worker is more skilled, more educated than the Indian one. So manufacturing sector is possible to do well, but you need better training and better skilling. And that's where the vocational program issue that I raised is this. Service sector, I have to understand, which part of the service sector are you talking about? Are you talking about software? Then most of our workers cannot go there. But there are other kinds of service sector maybe which are low skill, but dynamic. They're not that many, but we have to think of those.
Professor Aditya Mukherjee, can you try again? So no, please. So sorry, extremely sorry. Can you just sign out and come join again?
Yatendra says that there is some problem with the device of Professor Mukherjee because he has unmuted from this side. I don't know. You can try Professor Zoya Hassan in the meantime.
Yeah. Professor Zoya Hassan is also with us. Zoya ji, please share your views.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please. Yeah, you're audible. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. It was, as many of you have said, a very interesting, fascinating talk. But I have just one very brief comment, and that is I think Professor Bardhan said towards the end that he's going to spend 2 or 3 minutes on the responsibility, on who's responsible for illiberalism. And he made the point that the responsibility of the right in the erosion of liberal democracy is well known, and therefore he's not going to spend that much time about it, even though that is the title of his talk. And the title of his talk is Erosion of Liberal Democracy, on which he didn't really spend much time. He spoke, much of the talk was about the failures of the left, but equally the failures of the left are just as well known as are the problems of the right. And my point really is that while we all recognize, appreciate, and also appreciate the need to highlight the problems of the left and the failures of the left, but the point is that are the failures of the left responsible for the rise of the right? I'm not one to shy away from criticizing the left, and we're all, especially those of us who are on the left, are deeply aware of that. But I really wonder whether the failure of the left in India is responsible for the right. I can understand if one were to talk about the failures of the Congress and how some of the fatal mistakes that the Congress has made is certainly responsible for the rise of the right and the illiberalism that has followed. Because my point really is that, surely the rise of the right has a momentum of its own. And I think it is that momentum, and it's, after all, the right has been a work in progress for the past 100 years. And it has now come to fruition. And to what extent we can really blame the left for the rise of the right is an issue. Now, there's a second issue that he points out, where he talks about 3 illiberalisms of, I think, one of the left, one of Gandhian. I can't recall the third one that he mentioned. Now, fine. I think one would go along with the point about the illiberalism, and the point you also made about a friend of yours who was a Marxist and now calls himself a democratic socialist because he gives primacy to democracy, that without democracy, socialism is meaningless and it would be hollow. That point is well taken, and I think very many people on the left in India, as well as outside, recognize that. But I think that is an issue that is separate from the illiberalism of the right. And I think that is something that we need to squarely face. That doesn't really have to do, for example, and you mentioned UP, and UP is clearly a citadel of Hindutva. Gujarat is a citadel of Hindutva. Now, surely it would be hard to explain the rise of Hindutva and the kind of support it enjoys due to the failures of the left, because left has not been a major force in UP from the late 40s. That was it. So I think that is the point, is the relationship between the failures of the left and, if you will, the successes of the right. Thank you.
Let me respond by saying, I don't know whether you were there at the beginning of my talk. I actually said that some of the issues about the rise of the right all over the world, including India, but all over the world, is the main subject of my book, which I was referred to when I was introduced. So if anyone is interested in my answer, one can read that book. But I thought that if I spend most of my lecture today in criticizing the right, I'd be preaching to the converted. So it didn't waste my time. But I don't agree that the criticism of the left is widely recognized. I move all around my friends of the left. For example, I give you examples of why is it that I regard it as the fault of the left that the trade union movement is in decline and the overwhelming majority of the workers are nowhere. The left has not even tried to organize them. The overwhelming majority of the workers are informal. So I gave reasons for the left failures. It is not enough to say right has a momentum. Why has the left lost its momentum? Even the areas where they have some influence, Kerala, West Bengal, Tripura, 2 areas where West Bengal, they were dominant. Now they have 0 seats in them. It's not a left failure. It is a left failure. Even in UP, why is it that left has not any strength or any strength to speak of since 1940? It's the largest state in India. And if left cannot organize there, then we have to understand why. It's not enough to say, oh, UP you cannot do. We can only do Kerala, West Bengal. West Bengal is gone now. But so I regard it as an implicit failure of the left all over the world, not just in India. The rise of the right, I said in the beginning that in my book, I give about 5 or 6 different reasons. But I said that I'm going to emphasize in this lecture, because I know I'm addressing mostly leftists. I don't like preaching to the converted. So when I give a lecture in American right, or at least non-left audience, I criticize the right, because then that's a criticism they would like to think about. Telling them why the Modi is wrong or the right is wrong, to me, is useless in this audience. That's why I emphasize left failures. And we have to understand why the overwhelming majority of the poor in India are not voting left, including the Congress. For the time being, let me include left and liberals together and include the Congress. Why is it the Congress has lost support? Why is it none of the left parties are doing well, except small island of Kerala? And why? Because I'm coming from West Bengal, I have seen it, the decline of the left in an area where they used to be dominant. And now they have 0 seats. So we have to understand that. So that's the reason. Right from the beginning, I said that will be the emphasis of my lecture. I could give you a completely different lecture, as I do in a different audience, when I talk about the right wing. And also, as I mentioned in answer to another question, the right is much smarter, the way they're adjusting their thinking. How many people in the left are adjusting their thinking about globalization? I hear all the time, because most of my friends are left. Among them, I hear all the time the usual old rhetoric, anti-globalization rhetoric. Whereas the major beneficiaries of globalization, as I mentioned, are China and Vietnam. And the Communist Party in China and Communist Party in Vietnam are very much pro-globalization, not our left. I'm not saying there are no exceptions. There are exceptions. The majority of the left I meet are anti-globalization. Majority of workers in the United States, majority of the workers' parties in India are anti-globalization. We have to understand that things are changing, and we have to change our thinking accordingly. That's the reason for my emphasis.
So Aditya Mukherjee, can you please try again?
Yes.
Yeah, now you're audible. You're audible now.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Bardhan. I have been an avid reader of your work since the 1980s. It's absolutely brilliant lecture. Your out-of-the-box thinking, your emphasis on political economy distinguishes you from a large number of other economists. I totally agree with your perspective on globalization. We have written on that, identical views virtually on that how it needs to be looked at differently. Among the few Marxists who did that was Eric Hobsbawm, but we can discuss that later. The only thing I would add to your critique of the left, which is very good, that pure economism doesn't help. After all, Datta Samant walked away with the workers, which had been organized for the last 50 years in Bombay, under Dange's nose, right? And precisely because he could offer more. So you're quite right there. But to that, I would like to add the left's failure to deal with the question of nationalism. Just as the left has tended to talk of democracy as bourgeois democracy, they have also essentialized nationalism as bourgeois nationalism. In its writing for decades, they have done that, and they had no way. And people respond to the nationalism very strongly. We have allowed the right to walk away with it. So I would like to add that. On the issue of, I'll be very brief, and I know there are lots of questions. On the issue of the lack of liberalism in India, and you're picking on Gandhi, I would suggest that Gandhi, like Marx, as you correctly said, was a changing person. And I would appreciate if you would also be a bit changing on looking at Gandhi, because we've all from the left started with the perspective that you're talking about on Gandhi, a rather critical view of Gandhi. But I think we can reorient that a bit. Gandhi changes his positions substantially, dramatically on a whole bunch of issues, especially on caste. By the end of his life, he's talking a different language altogether. Of course, from the beginning of his childhood, he acts differently, but even in writing, he's changed his position completely. I mean,
About too many issues, I'll forget. So you have raised two issues, one about nationalism and the other was Gandhi. Can I respond to those?
Gandhi bit, huh? Can you please come in? Sir, on Gandhi, his shift, his liberalism is best expressed in one example that I will share with you, which you may not have noticed. In 1942, when the communists opposed in the August Kranti Maidan, the Quit India movement, Gandhi stood up immediately and praised the communists for their courage to stand out and say something which differs from everybody else. This is the mood of the nation, and they're standing against it. He protects them, and there are examples of this throughout. That this dialogical approach, this openness to opposition. If there was a liberal in my mind, it would be Gandhi. Living with a Nehru who writes an autobiography critiquing him. And being able to appreciate the other side. And last, sir, before you come in, I was quite surprised that you left Nehru out of it when you talked of liberalism and democracy. I mean, the first person apart from Gramsci in the late 30s who talks of that there being no socialism without democracy. I'm quoting verbatim Nehru. He says there is no socialism without democracy. Late 30s, mind you. He precedes the Euro-communists by several decades. He says socialism must be the socialism of 90%. He's given up dictatorship of the proletariat and stuff like that. And Nehru's whole life after independence, I mean, every letter he writes to the chief minister, every action he does in parliament is to build this, this whole liberal democratic framework. If one more critique was to be added to the left, I would add this, that they thought of Nehru, they completely misunderstood Nehru, did not look upon him as a Marxist, looked upon him as either a pinko or as a running dog of imperialism, and lost out on this huge opportunity that Nehru provided for the left to grow. Thank you.
Let me, so three issues, Nehru, in the reverse order, I'll go, Nehru, Gandhi, and nationalism. I am actually a great admirer of Nehru, which is, of course, unfashionable today.
Yeah.
And I would say, if you ask me to point to one of the greatest liberals in India, is Nehru. But liberal, not in the libertarian sense, left liberal, which is the right liberalism in my judgment. Nehru is one of the very few. But look what has happened to Nehru's ideas. Now Nehru is very unpopular and the wrong person. It's not just in the right, even the left. But by the way, since I'm quite old, I know about Hiren Mukherjee's book, The Gentle Colossus. That is the title of his book on Nehru, The Gentle Colossus. So CPI, the old CPI used to be admirer of Nehru, but CPM was not. But CPM was the larger party. So the larger part of the left was not happy with Nehru. And of course, Nehru himself, one thing is about 1930s ideas, but actual governing, he went with his Congress party, which is quite often in many parts of India, a landlord's party, and he went along with that. So there are things to criticize Nehru about, many things to criticize about them. But talking about liberal democracy, I would say Nehru is one of the greatest political leaders in terms of liberal democracy that India had. So I have no difference, I think, with you on Nehru. Gandhi has some difference, because one thing is to say what in practical politics, how you change your position. But the other is, I was talking about ideology. Gandhi, to the end of his life, if you asked him about where is it that your whole ideology in one place, he will go back to his 1909 book, which is Hind Swaraj. Hind Swaraj, to me, is largely illiberal. There are even sentences like, the parliament is like a prostitute. That's a Gandhian quote in Hind Swaraj. I think he believed in consensus, not majority, which is democracy emphasizes, or debates of the British style. To this day, the British the opposition undercuts the other party, etc. Gandhi did not like it at all. This kind of open debates. Now, yes, there are many ways he acted much more liberally than others. And in fact, when I mentioned Gandhi, I said, I have deep admiration for Gandhi. Deep admiration. For many ways, things that I did not have time to go into here. But the interesting distinction here, another person I did not mention is Tagore. And I think if you look at Tagore's ideology, Rabindranath Tagore's ideology and Mahatma Gandhi's ideology, the main difference is in liberalism. Rabindranath Tagore, like Nehru, was a liberal. I don't think Gandhiji, in that sense, was fully liberal. And I already gave examples of his basic, he believed in some traditional values of hierarchy. Caste, he changed his position, sure, but his belief was in a traditional hierarchical society. His ideal is the village republic of India, the Indian village. Indian village, as Ambedkar said, is a den of localism and casteism. So Indian village is not to be idealized. So I have deep admiration for Gandhi, but when it comes to liberalism, I do not think he was one of the most important liberals in India. He had great tolerance. So that liberalism he had, great tolerance for others. The main thing about illiberalism in India today is extreme intolerance. Gandhi did not have that. But in some other respects, particularly in terms of his respect for traditional hierarchical structure, and there is a paternalistic idea. He knows what is good for you. And some of it comes out in those of you who have seen the play Gandhi versus Gandhi, which is the play is essentially these arguments, counter arguments between his son, Hiralal Gandhi, and Mohandas Gandhi. And some of those paternalistic authoritarianism, which is illiberal, comes out in there. But anyway, I don't want to be misinterpreted. I admire Gandhi, but not for his liberalism. Yes, he had been liberal in some respects, but he's not like Nehru or like Rabindranath Tagore. He was not liberal in that sense. Let me come to nationalism. I think left has used nationalism in one way, but not in the other ways. I already mentioned in economic nationalism, the left has always, most of the time, being anti-globalization, they're in favor of protected industrialization and things like that. And unfortunately, that's very similar to the views of the Swadeshi Jagaran Manch of RSS. They're both constituted from this protectionist economic nationalism. So economic nationalism, left has used, but I think wrongly. It's very similar to the right's economic nationalism. Other respect, in fact, in my book, there's a whole chapter on nationalism, whole chapter. And I talk about nationalism ideas, which in some sense, Indian nationalism aspect has been underappreciated in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, nationalism is identified with the nation state. The two of these people I just mentioned were against the nation state. One is Gandhiji and the other is Tagore. Gandhi and Tagore, even though they differed in many respects, they were together in their attitude to nationalism. They essentially both said in Indian society, in India, society is more important than the state. We should not follow the Western nationalism in its overemphasis on the nation state. If you read Tagore's whole book on nationalism, which has set up 3 lectures he gave in Japan in 1916, that whole book is against Western nation state. And he says India, when it becomes independent, should not follow that. Gandhi was, of course, even more. Gandhi somewhere says he's an enlightened anarchist, so he did not like the state that much. But of course, you cannot today, in this day and age, you cannot run a country without a strong state. So Nehru and Ambedkar was in favor of the state, but Gandhiji and Tagore were not. But those are other kinds of issues. In terms of the nation state, there are today in the world, there are 2 dominant strands of nationalism. One is ethnic nationalism. Nationalism in India, BJP I regard as the stepchildren of Mr. Jinnah, because both Mr. Jinnah's Muslim League and BJP today, it used to be Hindu Mahasabha and then Jansangh before, where they looked at nationalism based on religion. Both Jinnah and Savarkar looked at nationalism based on religion. This is something that Gandhi rejected and the Congress in general rejected. So the nationalism that Congress went for, in some sense, today's terms, it would be called civic nationalism. In other words, nationalism that is based not on ethnicity, not on religion, but nationalism that is based on some syncretic values. Gandhiji and Tagore would say syncretic values, which come around from inside our society. The aspect that they emphasize is emphasized in the Bhakti movement in India. Bhakti movement, the folk culture, is a syncretic culture. And this pluralism is in Gandhi, is in Tagore, and is in Nehru. So Nehru, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Tagore went for civic nationalism, with the difference that Ambedkar and Nehru emphasized the state, Tagore and Gandhi emphasized the society much more. This underlying values of pluralism that is inside Indian society. So civic nationalism, and this may be some of you may not agree. The other example in India, historically, of civic nationalism is the United States. In a sense, if you think about the founding of the United States Constitution, the late 18th century, they did not go for Christian nationalism. They could have easily gone for Christian nationalism at a time when many of Europe was going for Christian nationalism. They went for civic nationalism. There were a lot of lapses. The whole race question means that they did not follow civic nationalism properly. But ideologically, they went for civic nationalism, not religious nationalism. In fact, let me give you a quote from Barack Obama. In 2009, he gave a speech. I quote that in my book. He said, "It is a great strength of the United States that we are not a Christian nation." This is Barack Obama. Same with Abraham Lincoln. Gettysburg, the famous Gettysburg Address. What is the first line? "We are a nation based on liberty, not religion, not Christianity. We are a nation based on liberty. You may have lapsed in how you followed liberty. You did not give liberty to the blacks, but he was fighting slavery. But so this is what I'm calling civic nationalism, based on certain liberal values. Germany is an interesting country. Germany, for a time, went for ethnic nationalism. Nazi nationalism is ethnic nationalism. By the way, if you read Savarkar, if you read Golwalkar, they are in great admiration of Nazi Germany, openly. There's no, it's not they were underhand about it. They're openly admiring Nazi Germany. So because the principle is about ethnic nationalism. So German history is interesting. German history has fluctuated from one kind of nationalism to another, from Nazi ethnic nationalism. Today, for quite some time, their nationalism is civic nationalism. And the most important German philosopher, Habermas, has written on this issue. Habermas says that, and he calls it constitutional patriotism. That's Habermas's words. What is constitutional patriotism? He says, we are patriotic, we are nationalistic, but our nationalism has to be based on the liberal principles of the Constitution. Okay? Habermas is left, but is very much emphasizes the liberal values of the Constitution. So in that sense, he's a great liberal. And in fact, he says German immigration policy has to be, he did not believe in multilateralism, by the way. He says, whichever country you may immigrate from, whichever religion you may immigrate from, you have to conform to the liberal principles of the Constitution. So, and I'm giving the example, if you wear a hijab, that's fine, because hijab is not against liberalism. But if you do oppress women, genital mutilation, that's against liberalism. That's against the German Constitution. So he's not against multilateralism. Multilateralism is every culture up to its own. So Habermas is saying, no, that's not the kind of nationalism that I believe in. I believe in constitutional patriotism. That's his word. So that's my 2 cents on nationalism. I have a whole chapter on nationalism. Please read that chapter.
Professor Bardhan, I'm sorry to come in for the second time. It's because what you were saying just now in your book, you call United States a coming together nation, and you call India a holding, coming together state, and India you call holding state, meaning thereby that India remains together largely on account of a state. But India has been India despite most of the time not having an empire, not having a very strong state. There is something underlying that in the society, if you emphasize the society dimension, there is something underlying across the subcontinent that gives it some kind of civilizational cultural identity on the basis of which in modern times one can imagine a nation. So
I think you are probably not quite reading it in the context where it's about the history of federalism, how the federalism came into being. In the United States, starting with separate states, and then they came together. So coming together, and so it's a context, the context that I talked about is federalism. Different countries have different histories of federalism. United States federalism is different states came together, and when different states come together, the states retain a lot of power. So coming together federalism usually gives a lot of power to the constituents who come together. Holding together federalism, where by and large, the whole country was already together, but you want to bind it together with the Constitution. That's the holding together Constitution. usually gives more power to the center. So think about Ambedkar and Nehru. Indian federalism is one of the most centralized federalism in the world. It gives the central government too much power. Otherwise, if Ambedkar and Nehru did not give the central government that much power, can you imagine any federal country, what we have done in India, a federal government breaks a state into three union territories. It's impossible to do in other federal countries. In United States, Canada, these are federal countries. You cannot legally do it or even politically do it. But in India, you break a state and make it a three union territories, mostly supported by the rest of the country. How many protests did you see when a state is broken into 3 union territories and then controlled from the center? That tells you how much power the central government. So that's the context. Holding together nationalism, federalism gives the center too much power. And I think the Indian state has too much, Indian central government has too much power, which the current government is misusing and abusing.
There is one question in the chat box. I would like to read it out
It's
for you.
midnight now.
Yeah. Just last question. Just can you just a small question, because the question is, can capitalism, crony or otherwise, one sec, remain compatible with welfareism in countries like India? That is the last question by Comrade Sridhar.
It can manage it. I'm not saying this is an ideal combination. The way the vote management goes in India, they have figured out, at least for some time, you go on giving all the power to the cronies, and the cronies then contribute money to your funds. 90% of the funds, corporate donations, as I mentioned, go to the ruling party. And you get the support of the poor. And that's where I again call it the failure of the left. A country where so many people are poor, the overwhelming majority, the majority of the poor are voting for this right-wing party, not the left. That's a failure of the left. And they have figured out that if you give these gifts of the prime minister, some this welfare measure, that welfare measure, same thing that the UPA government earlier did in terms of the right. Food Security Act was a right to food. The Rural Employment Guarantee was a right of the worker. But now these are all gifts of the Prime Minister. And then some more gifts, Swachh Bharat or Ujjwala. These are all Prime Minister's gifts. They have figured out that, and with their large propaganda machine, they have, at least for the time being, persuaded the poor that we are doing all these things for you. Take this gift. We are doing this for you. And they're voting. Now, this may not go on for a long enough time, but it's already 10. This is their 10th year. This is going on. So it is possible for a time. I don't know if it's long run will be that. I hope not. But it is the right has shown they have been much smarter in getting the support of the poor than the left. And by the way, other regional parties are learning it. So Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal does the same thing. Give these gifts, Mamata's gifts to the, and Mamata has succeeded in replacing the left. Left has 0 seats in the West Bengal Assembly. And the poor are voting for Mamata because there are all these Mamata's gifts that they're getting, even though most of the people, Mamata has done very little for the economy, West Bengal economy. But so this works for a time. How long it will work, I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Bardhan, for this, as I said, exciting presentation and for many of the issues which we have been discussing within NSI. So lot many things came up in your discussion. So once again, thanks, and extremely sorry that some other questions were there in the chat box and we could not invite some other people because it's midnight in there where Professor Bardhan is there. So once again, thanks you all for being here and participating in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.